1 year after the human departure, the council chambers felt like a monument to failure. Vexahari stood at the speaker podium, where Jake Miller had delivered his final address, and felt the weight of everything that had been lost through willful blindness and stubborn pride. The crisis had passed, barely, but galactic civilization limped forward as a shadow of what it had been when humans were part of it. The empty human delegation seats had been left unchanged, not as a gesture of hope for their return, but as a reminder of the price of assumptions. Emergency teams had managed to restore basic functionality to the critical systems that humans had maintained, but the elegant efficiency was gone forever. Everything worked, but nothing worked well. Chris Morgan had been the human historian assigned to document interspecies cooperation for the Council archives. His final message to the galaxy had been discovered a month ago, hidden in the communication buffer of an abandoned human research station. Vexahari had read the message dozens of times, but today she would read it aloud to the full council assembly, for the first time. The decision to leave was not made in anger, Chris's message began. Anger implies that we expected different treatment and were disappointed when we didn't receive it. By the time we made this decision, we had moved beyond disappointment to acceptance. We accepted that the council would never see us as equals, and we accepted that this was not a failure on our part, but a limitation on theirs. The council chamber was silent as Vexahari continued reading. Representatives from 49 species listened to words that had been written for them but delivered too late for the understanding to matter. We leave behind detailed instructions for everything we built, maintained, and improved during our time with you. This is not charity or obligation. This is hope. Hope that someday you will value the contributions of others the way you should, have valued ours. Hope that someday you will see newcomers as potential partners rather than potential problems. Hope that someday you will judge species by what they can become rather than what you assume they are. Helen Turner had been 8 years old when the humans left, the daughter of Amy Foster and one of the youngest humans in Council territory. Her teacher's notes had been found in the abandoned education center on New Terra, and they revealed conversations. That now seemed prophetic. Why do the other people seem scared of us? Helen had asked during a lesson about interspecies cooperation. Her teacher, Amy Foster, had paused her lesson and knelt down to Helen's eye level. Sometimes when people are different, others need time to understand them. We've been patient, and we've been kind, and we've shown them who we really are. But some people take a very long time to see. How long do we have to wait? Helen had asked. We don't have to wait forever, sweetheart. If people can't see who we really are after, we've given them every chance, then maybe we need to find people who can. Helen had nodded with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possessed. Like finding new friends when the old ones aren't nice anymore. Exactly like that, Amy had said. Those words had been spoken 2 months before the departure, when Amy Foster was already helping to plan humanity's new future while still trying to make the old future work. The conversation revealed that humans had been preparing their children for the possibility of leaving, teaching them that staying where you weren't valued wasn't loyalty but self-harm. The council's memorial vote was unanimous but meaningless. They declared humanity honored departed and established memorial gardens on every council world, but the gesture felt hollow when the honored species had chosen to leave rather than stay and be honored. The memorials became reminders of failure rather than celebrations of contribution. Vexahari visited the memorial garden on the council homeworld every week, walking among the displays that documented human achievements and innovations. Each exhibit told the story of human contributions that had been dismissed, ignored, or misattributed during their time with the Council. The garden was beautiful and comprehensive and utterly devastating in its revelation of what had been lost. Ben. Carter's shield technology was now being implemented across Council fleets, credited finally to its actual inventor. But Ben Carter was building better shields for human ships in a distant galaxy, and the Council was left with outdated versions of technology he had improved beyond their understanding. Amy Foster's mediation techniques were being taught in diplomatic academies throughout Council territory, finally recognized as revolutionary advances in interspecies communication. But Amy Foster was solving bigger problems between human colonies that were building something unprecedented in the history of galactic civilization. Paul Johnson's logistics systems were being studied and copied by trade specialists who finally understood the complexity of what he had been doing. But Paul Johnson was coordinating supply chains across multiple galaxies for a human civilization that was expanding faster than any species in recorded history. The reports from long-range sensors confirmed what the Council had feared and what they had secretly hoped. Human civilization was not just surviving in their new territory. It was flourishing beyond anything they had achieved in Council space. The humans had taken their patience, their innovation, their quiet competence, and their refusal to accept limitations, and they had built something extraordinary. They're terraforming planets at a rate that should be impossible, Science Director Yelmari reported during a council session that was supposed to be about trade regulations but had become another discussion of the humans they had lost. They're establishing new colonies faster than we can map them. Their population is growing, their technology is advancing, and their territory is expanding in ways that surpass our theoretical models for civilization development. The most disturbing reports came from border sensors that detected human exploration, ships mapping systems near Council territory. The humans weren't hiding from the Council. They were studying it, analyzing it, learning from its mistakes as they built something better. 6 months ago, the Council had received a message beacon from human space. The message was brief and formal, the kind of diplomatic communication that might be sent between distant allies who respected each other but had no close relationship. To the Galactic Council, the message had read. Humanity has established itself successfully in the Andromeda Galaxy cluster. We have built a civilization based on principles of mutual respect, collaborative innovation, and shared prosperity. When your civilization is ready to interact with us on the basis of equality and genuine partnership, these are the coordinates where you can find us. We will be here. The coordinates were included in the message, along with communication protocols for making contact. The humans had given the Council a roadmap for reconciliation, but they had also made clear that reconciliation would require fundamental changes in how the Council operated. Vexhari had proposed immediate contact, but the Council had voted to defer the decision pending further analysis of the implications. That had been 6 months ago, and the analysis continued while human civilization grew stronger and more independent every day. The truth that no one wanted to admit was that the Council was afraid to make contact. They were afraid that the humans would reject any overture. They were afraid that the humans would accept contact, but demand changes that the Council wasn't ready to make. Most of all, they were afraid that the humans would offer them a chance to join something better than what they had built for themselves. We could send a diplomatic mission, Council Member Torgash had suggested during the last discussion of human contact. A formal delegation to establish relationships with their new government. What would we offer them? Vexhari had asked. What do we have that they need? They've built their own civilization from nothing. They have better technology, better organization, better cooperation between their settlements than we have between our species. Why would they want anything to do with us? The question had ended the discussion because no one had an answer. The Council had nothing to offer humans except membership in a system that had failed them before. The humans had moved beyond needing what the Council could provide. Vexhari stood alone in the memorial garden as the artificial sunset painted the sky in colors that reminded her of hope. The human memorial was beautiful, but it was also a gravestone for the Council's credibility. Every species in the galaxy knew that humans had left because they hadn't been treated as equals. Every species wondered if they would be next if the Council decided they weren't important enough to respect. The council chambers, where voices had once debated the future of civilization, now felt hollow and diminished. The careful voices that had asked hard questions were gone. The patient mediators who had prevented conflicts were gone. The innovative thinkers who had solved impossible problems were gone. In their place was silence, and in that silence was the echo of everything that could have been if the Council had possessed the wisdom to see what they had when they had it. The humans had left coordinates and an invitation, but they had also left a challenge. The Council could remain as it was, diminished and limited by its own prejudices, or it could find the courage to become something. The search for humanity began with the largest mobilization of resources in galactic history. Every available ship, every advanced sensor array, every long-range communication system was dedicated to finding where the humans had gone. The Council authorized unlimited funding for the search operations, but what they found was more disturbing than what they didn't find. Admiral Krextal led the first wave of search ships to the edge of Council territory, following the last known human exploration routes. His fleet included representatives from 12 different species, all equipped with their most advanced detection technology. They expected to find human settlements in the frontier regions beyond mapped space. Instead, they found evidence of human activity going back years in places where no one thought humans had been. Mining operations that had been abandoned but showed signs of advanced extraction techniques. Communication relay stations that weren't on any official charts but were still broadcasting automated signals. Supply depots hidden in asteroid fields that contained materials and equipment designed for long-term space exploration. These installations are at least 3 years old, Krextal reported to the Council. The humans were building infrastructure out here while they were still participating fully in Council activities. This wasn't a sudden decision to leave. This was a long-term evacuation plan. Tony Rodriguez had been the human scientist responsible for developing faster-than-light communication technology. His official research focused on improving message transmission speeds between Council worlds, work that had resulted in modest improvements to existing systems. The search teams discovered that Tony's real work had been far more ambitious. Hidden research facilities in the Deep Range contained prototypes of communication technology that surpassed anything the Council had imagined possible. Tony had developed transmission methods that could send messages across intergalactic distances in real time, technology that opened up possibilities for communication with regions of space that other species considered unreachable. The research logs showed that Tony had been testing his technology for 2 years before the human departure. He had been sending experimental signals to distant galaxies and receiving responses that proved his system worked across impossible distances. The humans hadn't just been planning to leave Council territory. They had been planning to leave the galaxy entirely. Tony's communication breakthrough changes everything we know about long-range exploration, Science Director Yelmari told the search committee. With this technology, humans could maintain contact with civilizations that are millions of light years away. They're not just hiding beyond our borders. They could be anywhere in the universe. Emma Davis had been a human philosopher whose writings were generally ignored by council academics. Her papers on identity, belonging, and the search for meaning were considered too abstract to have practical value. The search teams found her complete writings in the abandoned human libraries and discovered that Emma's work contained a detailed philosophical framework for understanding the human departure. Her essay, The Courage of Leaving, had been published 6 months before the humans disappeared. Reading it now, Vexhari realized it was essentially a manifesto explaining why the departure was necessary and inevitable. There comes a point in every relationship, Emma had written, where trying harder to be accepted becomes self-destructive. When your presence is tolerated but never celebrated, when your contributions are used but never acknowledged, when your perspective is heard but never valued, you face a choice between diminishing yourself to fit into a space that doesn't want you, or finding the courage to create a space where you can be fully yourself. Emma's later essays explored the concept of dignified withdrawal as a form of self-respect. She argued that leaving a situation where you weren't valued wasn't giving up or admitting defeat. It was recognizing your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserved. The greatest act of hope, Emma had written in her final published piece, is sometimes walking away from what is toward what could be. It takes incredible faith in yourself and your people to abandon security and comfort for the possibility of something better. The search teams realized they weren't just looking for humans who had moved to a new location. They were looking for humans who had fundamentally reimagined what their future could look like. Rick Thompson had been the lead human explorer for frontier mapping missions, officially responsible for charting new trade routes and identifying potential colony sites within Council territory. The search teams discovered that Rick's real exploration work had extended far beyond his official assignments. His personal logs contained detailed maps of star systems in distant galaxies, complete with analysis of planetary conditions, resource, availability, and strategic positioning. Rick hadn't just been exploring. He had been conducting comprehensive surveys for large-scale colonization efforts that would support millions of people. Rick's exploration data covers territory that should have taken centuries to map, Admiral Krextall reported. He was using advanced survey techniques and exploration technologies that are decades ahead of our current capabilities. The humans weren't just planning to leave. They were planning to build something bigger than what they left behind. The most detailed exploration reports focused on a galaxy cluster approximately 2 million light-years from Council territory. Rick's surveys identified thousands of habitable worlds with abundant resources and no signs of existing intelligent life. His analysis suggested that the region could support human civilization on a scale that would dwarf their presence in Council space. The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't left because they were defeated or discouraged. They had left because they had found something better. They had discovered the possibility of building a civilization where they could develop their full potential without the limitations imposed by Council prejudices and assumptions. Tony Rodriguez's communication tests had established contact with human advance teams who had been preparing settlement sites for years. The advance teams reported successful establishment of preliminary colonies and confirmed that the target galaxy cluster was ideal for large-scale human expansion. The search committee realized they were dealing with a migration rather than a disappearance. The humans hadn't vanished. They had executed a carefully planned relocation to territory where they could build their own civilization according to their own values and priorities. "They're not lost," Vex Hari told the council during an emergency session. "They're exactly where they want to be, doing exactly what they plan to do. The question isn't where they went. The question is whether we have anything to offer that would make them want to come back." The answer to that question became clear as more details of the human departure emerged. The humans had taken their most advanced technology, their most innovative thinkers, and their most valuable resources. They had left behind instruction manuals and basic equipment, but they had kept everything that represented their greatest achievements and highest potential. Ben Carter's shield technology had been refined and improved beyond the versions he had presented to the council. Tony Rodriguez's communication systems enabled coordination across intergalactic distances. Rick Thompson's exploration data revealed terraforming capabilities that could create habitable worlds from barren planets. The humans hadn't just been participating in galactic civilization. They had been developing technologies and capabilities that surpassed it. Lisa Brooks's final research had predicted exactly what was happening now. When a species reaches the point where their growth is limited by the environment they're in, she had written, they face three choices: adapt to the limitations, try to change the environment, or find a new environment. Humans have always been a species that chooses the third option. The search teams continued their work, but the goal was no longer finding humans who were lost. The goal was understanding humans who had found something better than what the Council could offer. The evidence suggested that human civilization was not only surviving in their new location, but thriving in ways that would have been impossible under Council oversight. Emma Davis had been right about the courage required to leave. It took tremendous faith to abandon everything familiar for the possibility of something better, but the humans had possessed that faith, and the early reports suggested their faith had been justified. The Council was forced to confront the reality that they weren't dealing with a crisis of missing members. They were dealing with the success of former members who had outgrown the need for Council participation. The humans hadn't left because they couldn't make it work. They had left because they were capable of something greater than making it work. For the first time in Council history, they faced the possibility that membership in galactic civilization wasn't the highest achievement a species could reach. Sometimes, the highest achievement was having the courage and capability to build something better. The first supply crisis began 6 weeks after the humans disappeared, but nobody connected it to their absence until it was too late. Paul Johnson had been the logistics coordinator for the Galactic Trade Commission, a job that most council members thought involved simple paperwork and basic math. They discovered too late that Paul had been performing miracles of organization that kept 49 different species supplied with everything they needed. Vex Hari stood in the emergency session of the Trade Commission and listened to reports of shortages cascading across 12 star systems. The Zephyrian colonies were running out of medical supplies. The Cortex mining operations had no replacement parts for their equipment. The agricultural worlds couldn't get their harvests to the populations that needed food. How did this happen? So quickly, Commissioner Yeldan demanded. Our trade routes have been stable for decades. Trade Director Morgan pulled up the shipping manifests on the main display. The routes are the same, but the scheduling has collapsed. Ships are arriving at the wrong times, carrying the wrong cargo, or missing their destinations entirely. It's like the whole system has forgotten how to coordinate, but the system hadn't forgotten. Paul Johnson had been the one doing the coordinating, and nobody had realized how complex that job actually was. The investigation team found his office filled with charts and calculations that mapped the movement of thousands of ships across hundreds of trade routes. Every delivery schedule had been optimized to prevent conflicts, reduce waiting times, and ensure that critical supplies reached their destinations when they were needed. Paul had worked with shipping schedules the way a musician worked with symphony orchestration. He had understood that moving cargo through space wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, it was about timing, about knowing which routes would be crowded on which days, about ensuring that slow cargo ships didn't block fast emergency transports, about coordinating with local traffic patterns around different worlds. The trade routes hadn't changed, but the subtle adjustments that made them work efficiently had died with Paul's departure. Without his constant fine-tuning, the entire system was falling apart like a watch with missing gears. Kate Williams had worked as a cultural interpreter for the Diplomatic Corps, another job that council members had considered relatively unimportant. They thought her work involved simple translation and basic etiquette advice. The reality was far more complex, and they learned that reality through a series of diplomatic disasters that erupted across the galaxy. The Belani-Tectani incident started with a trade negotiation that should have been routine. Both species were longtime council members with established diplomatic relationships. The discussion was about sharing research data on crystal growth technology, something that had been done successfully many times before, but without Kate Williams. To navigate the cultural complexities, the negotiation turned into a disaster within hours. The Belani delegation interpreted the Tectani research proposals as an insult to their scientific capabilities. The Tectani delegation assumed the Belani were deliberately withholding information as a power play. What should have been a simple exchange of knowledge became an accusation of bad faith that threatened to end scientific cooperation between two major research powers. Vex Hari found Kate's cultural briefing files in the Diplomatic Corps archives. They contained detailed analysis of how different species expressed concepts like respect, uncertainty, and disagreement. Kate had mapped the subtle cultural signals that could turn friendly negotiations into hostile confrontations if misinterpreted. Belani. Research presentations always begin with acknowledgement of what they don't know, Kate had written in one briefing. This isn't false modesty or admission of weakness. It's how they show respect for the complexity of the subject. If their research partners don't respond with similar acknowledgement, Belani assume they're being dismissed as inferior. Tectani never asked direct questions during initial negotiations. They present their position and wait for responses that demonstrate understanding. If their partners ask clarifying questions, Tectani interpret this as evidence that their position wasn't clear enough, which they consider embarrassing. Without Kate's guidance, both species had unknowingly followed behavior patterns that the other species found offensive. The Belani had asked questions that made the Tectani feel embarrassed. The Tectani had failed to acknowledge uncertainty in ways that made the Belani feel dismissed. A negotiation that Kate could have guided to success in 2 days had instead created a diplomatic crisis that might take years to resolve. The pattern repeated across the galaxy as species that had worked together successfully for years suddenly found themselves in conflicts based on cultural misunderstandings. The humans hadn't just been translating languages. They had been translating entire worldviews, helping different species understand not just what others were saying, but what they meant when they said it. Danny Clark had maintained the technical infrastructure that kept different species' technology, systems working together. His job title was Systems Compatibility Analyst, which made it sound like he just ran compatibility tests on computer programs. The reality was that Danny had been performing constant maintenance on the technological nervous system of galactic civilization. The first major system failure happened at the Nexus Communication Hub, the central relay station that handled interstellar communications for the entire Council territory. Different species used different communication protocols, different encryption methods, and different data transmission standards. Danny had built and maintained the complex translation systems that allowed them all to talk to each other. Without Danny's maintenance, the translation systems began to fail. Messages arrived garbled, encrypted communications couldn't be decoded, and emergency signals were lost in translation between incompatible protocols. Within 2 weeks, reliable communication between different species became impossible. The cascade effect was immediate and devastating. Trade negotiations collapsed when the parties couldn't understand each other's messages. Military coordinated response became impossible when different fleets couldn't share tactical information. Scientific collaboration stopped when researchers couldn't exchange data. Danny's maintenance logs showed that he had been running diagnostic checks and repairs on the communication system constantly. Every day, some component failed or some compatibility issue arose that required immediate attention. The system only appeared stable because Danny had been working around the clock to keep it stable. The power grid failures started in the outer territories and spread inward like a disease. Different species had built their power generation systems using different technologies, different energy sources, and different distribution methods. The unified galactic power grid required constant balancing to ensure that energy flowed smoothly between incompatible systems. Danny had been managing that balancing act for 5 years. His computers monitored thousands of power generation facilities across hundreds of worlds, making real-time adjustments to prevent overloads, shortages, and system conflicts. The grid hadn't failed during his tenure because he never let it fail. Without Danny's oversight, the grid began to unravel. Power stations that had worked together efficiently started having conflicts over load distribution. Energy surges from one system damaged equipment in another. Worlds that had relied on shared power resources found themselves facing blackouts when automated systems couldn't handle the complex balancing that Danny had done manually. The life support failures were the most frightening. Space stations and colony habitats throughout Council territory used integrated life support systems that combined technologies from multiple species. Atmospheric processors from one species worked with gravity generators from another and water, recycling systems from a third. The integration required constant monitoring and adjustment to ensure that all the different systems worked together safely. Danny's files contained thousands of emergency interventions where he had prevented life, support failures that could have killed millions of people, atmospheric mix problems on research stations, gravity fluctuations on mining platforms, water contamination on agricultural colonies, all problems that had been solved quickly and quietly by Danny's intervention before anyone realized how close they had come to disaster. Now those interventions weren't happening. The life support systems were failing, and the different species' technical teams couldn't communicate effectively enough to coordinate repairs. People were dying because the infrastructure that kept them alive required human maintenance that was no longer available. Vexhari stood in the Council Emergency Command Center and watched the reports streaming in from across the galaxy. Supply shortages, diplomatic crises, communication failures, power grid collapse, life support emergencies. Every critical system that the Council depended on was breaking down simultaneously. How did we not know? She asked the assembled emergency coordinators. How did we not realize that humans were maintaining all of this? Emergency Coordinator Feltalk looked exhausted. Because they never asked for credit or recognition. They just did the work and filed reports that everyone assumed were routine. Ben Carter had tried to explain his shield technology to the Council's Defense Committee 17 times before he gave up. Vex Hari watched the recordings of those presentations and felt shame burning in her chest. Each time Ben had stood at the presentation podium with his simple diagrams and patient voice, explaining how human understanding of energy manipulation could revolutionize defensive systems across the galaxy. The principle is straightforward, Ben had said in his first presentation 4 years ago. Instead of trying to stop incoming energy, we redirect it. Think of it like water flowing around a stone instead of hitting a wall. Committee Chairman Zekthor had dismissed the idea immediately. Primitive thinking. Energy cannot be redirected without massive power requirements. This human ignores basic physics. But Ben hadn't ignored physics. He had understood it differently. The recordings showed him explaining how human intuition about natural forces had led to breakthrough discoveries. He had built working prototypes that demonstrated 90% energy efficiency in deflecting attacks that would destroy conventional shields. The Defense Committee had tested his technology and found it worked exactly as Ben claimed. Then, they had filed the reports under unverified technologies and forgotten about them. Vex Hari paused the recording and rubbed her temples. The committee hadn't called Ben's technology unverified because it didn't work. They had called it unverified because they couldn't understand how it worked, and that made them uncomfortable. It was easier to ignore human innovation than to admit humans might understand something they didn't. Amy Foster's mediation records told a similar story. The human diplomat had resolved 3 major trade disputes that had threatened to become wars, but the official reports credited the solutions to the primary species involved. Amy had developed new techniques for cross-cultural communication that made complex negotiations possible. The key, Amy had explained to Vex Hari once, is understanding that every species thinks they're being logical, but logic looks different depending on your perspective. My job is to help everyone see the logic in everyone else's position. The Cortex-Balani trade war had lasted 6 months before Amy got involved. 2 species had been fighting over mining rights in the sector system, with each side convinced the other was being deliberately unreasonable. Amy had spent 1 week with each delegation, not arguing or negotiating, just listening and asking questions. Then she had brought both sides together and presented what she called a perspective map. She showed how each species' demands made perfect sense from their point of view, and how their fears about the other side were based on misunderstandings rather than malice. Within 2 days, they had reached an agreement that gave both sides more than they had originally asked for. The official report stated that productive dialogue between Cortex and Balani representatives led to mutually beneficial resolution. Amy Foster was mentioned once in a footnote as human observer present during negotiations. Steve Parker's military strategies had saved thousands of lives, but the credit always went to the commanders who implemented his plans. Steve had a gift for seeing battlefield patterns that others missed. He could predict enemy movements and suggest countermeasures that seemed impossible until they worked. During the Void Raider attacks on the outer colonies, conventional military thinking had failed completely. The Raiders used hit-and-run tactics that made traditional defensive strategies useless. After 6 months of failed operations, someone finally asked Steve for his opinion. "You're trying to guard everything," Steve had told the Joint Military Command, "but you can't protect every target. Instead, make it so they can only attack targets you want them to attack." His strategy involved deliberately weakening defenses at certain locations while secretly strengthening others. When the raiders attacked, what looked like easy targets, they found themselves trapped in carefully prepared kill zones. Within 3 weeks, the raider threat was eliminated. The victory reports praised innovative tactical thinking by Joint Command Forces. Steve Parker was listed among dozens of other advisors and consultants who had provided input during the planning process. Vex Hari discovered that this pattern existed in every area where humans had contributed to council activities. Human innovations were implemented and credited to other species. Human solutions were adopted and attributed to committee decisions. Human insights were incorporated and labeled as collaborative breakthroughs. The humans had never complained about the lack of recognition. They had never demanded credit or threatened to withhold their contributions. They had simply continued working, solving problems, and making life better for everyone in the galaxy, while being systematically erased from the official records of their own achievements. The investigation committee found evidence that humans had been documenting everything. Not complaints or protests, just careful records of what they had contributed and how those contributions had been received. Jake Miller's personal files contained a detailed timeline of human innovations and their official attribution to other species. It read like an inventory of stolen identity, defensive shield technology, attributed to Cortex Military Research Division, energy efficiency improvements, credited to Zephyrian Engineering Collective, diplomatic mediation protocols, classified as standard council procedures developed by committee consensus. The list went on for hundreds of pages. Every major breakthrough in council technology, diplomacy, or military strategy over the past 7 years could be traced back to human innovation that had been officially credited to someone else. Lisa Brooks had tried to explain the problem in her final research presentation. When a species contributes to a group but receives no recognition for those contributions, they eventually stop feeling like part of the group. This isn't about pride or status. It's about belonging. The science committee had nodded politely and filed her research under theoretical social studies. Nobody had considered that Lisa might be talking about humans rather than the animal subjects she usually studied. Vex Hari found audio recordings of conversations between human delegates that revealed how they really felt about their situation. The humans had private meeting rooms where they could speak freely, and the investigation had uncovered the communication logs from those sessions. "It doesn't matter how many problems we solve," Ben Carter had said during one meeting. "They'll never see us as anything more than lucky primitives who occasionally stumble onto something useful. The question," Amy Foster had replied, "is whether we keep trying to prove ourselves to people who have already decided what we are, or whether we go find people who are willing to see what we actually are." Jake Miller had ended that conversation with words that now seemed prophetic. "We've been patient for 7 years. Maybe it's time to be patient somewhere else." The humans hadn't left because they were angry or frustrated, though they had every right to be both. They had left because they finally understood that no amount of contribution or cooperation would change how the council saw them. They could solve every problem, prevent every war, and revolutionize every technology, and they would still be considered primitive newcomers who got lucky sometimes. Vex Hari realized that the council had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had assumed that humans would be grateful for the opportunity to participate in galactic civilization, regardless of how they were treated. They had assumed that being included was enough, even if that inclusion came without respect or recognition. But humans, it turned out, valued dignity more than inclusion. They would rather be respected equals somewhere else than tolerated guests in the council. They had given the galaxy 7 years to see them as partners rather than charity cases, and when it became clear that would never happen, they had chosen to find a place where it would. The weight of that realization settled on Vex Hari like a heavy blanket. The Council had not lost humans because of any dramatic conflict or irreconcilable difference. They had lost humans because they had never truly accepted them in the first place. Every dismissal, every misattributed innovation, every patronizing comment had been a small rejection that added up to a clear message: you don't belong here. The humans had simply listened to that message and acted accordingly. They had found their own way to belong somewhere else, leaving behind only the echo of everything the Council had lost through its own blindness and pride. In her private office that night, Vex Hari read through Ben Carter's complete shield technology specifications. The mathematics were elegant, the physics were sound, and the practical applications were revolutionary. Any species in the galaxy would have been proud to claim credit for such an innovation. But Ben Carter had been human, so his breakthrough had been filed away and forgotten, while lesser innovations from established species received praise and implementation. The Council had thrown away advances that could have changed the balance of power in the galaxy because they came from the wrong source. That was the real weight of assumptions, Vex Hari realized. Not just what they had cost the humans, but what they had cost everyone else. Speaker Vex Hari walked through the empty council chambers and felt something cold in her chest. 3 months had passed since the humans left, and the silence still felt wrong. The great hall where 50 different species once argued and debated now echoed with only 49 voices. The human seats sat empty, like missing teeth in a smile. She stopped at the human delegation area and touched the smooth metal of Jake Miller's chair. The human ambassador had sat here for 7 years and never once raised his voice in anger. Even when other council members called his people primitive or lucky, Jake would just smile that calm human smile and present more data. Vex Hari remembered, thinking humans were too soft for galactic politics. Now she wondered if they had been too good for it. The security footage from that last day played in her mind again. She had watched it dozens of times, trying to find some clue, some warning she had missed. Jake Miller had walked to the speaker podium with his usual quiet confidence. His dark hair was turning gray at the edges, and his brown eyes held that patient look humans always seem to have when talking to the council. "Honored members," Jake had said in his steady voice, "humanity has decided to pursue new horizons. We thank you for the opportunity to participate in this great experiment of cooperation. We leave behind detailed guides for all our contributions to council projects. We hope they serve you well." That was it. No anger, no threats, no dramatic speeches about injustice, just a polite goodbye that everyone assumed meant humans were taking a break from some council activities. Nobody thought they meant forever. Nobody thought they meant everyone. Vex Hari's assistant, a young Zephyrian named Quinn, approached with careful steps. "Speaker, the investigation teams have reported again. Still no trace of human settlements in the Outer Rim territories. What about their home system?" Vex Hari asked, though she already knew the answer. Empty. Their cities are intact, their factories still running on automatic systems, but no people, not even bodies. It's like they all just stopped existing. But they hadn't stopped existing. That was what made this so disturbing. Every human had vanished at exactly the same moment across the entire galaxy. From the smallest research outpost to their massive home cities, every single human had disappeared without a trace. No signs of struggle, no distress signals, no evidence of forced evacuation. Vexhari remembered Lisa Brooks, the human xenobiologist who had worked with her science committee for 5 years. Lisa had always been fascinated by how different species adapted to new environments. She had published papers on interspecies cooperation that other scientists called interesting but impractical. Lisa had a way of seeing connections that others missed. 2 weeks before the humans left, Lisa had submitted her final research report. Vexhari had barely glanced at it then, but now she had memorized every word. The report was titled, Adaptation Strategies When Home Becomes Hostile. At the time, everyone assumed Lisa was studying animal behavior. Now, Vexhari understood Lisa had been studying human behavior. The most successful adaptation, Lisa had written, is not fighting the hostile environment, but finding a new environment where the species can thrive. Sometimes survival means having the courage to leave. The Council had formed investigation teams immediately after discovering the disappearance. They sent ships to every known human settlement and found the same thing everywhere. Empty buildings with lights still on, meals half-finished on tables, but no people. The humans had left everything behind except themselves. What made it worse was what they had left behind. Every human facility contained detailed instruction manuals for their technology and processes. Jake Miller's office held comprehensive guides for all the diplomatic protocols he had developed. Lisa Brooks's laboratory contained step-by-step instructions for her research methods. It was as if they knew they would never return and wanted to make sure their work could continue without them. The Galactic Council had existed for 3,000 years before humans joined. In those 3,000 years, no species had ever just left. There had been wars, expulsions, and extinctions, but never a voluntary total departure. The concept was so foreign that the Council had no procedures for it. Vexhari walked to the viewing wall that showed the galaxy map. Thousands of star systems twinkled in the display, marking the territories of Council member species. The human systems still showed on the map, but now they glowed with a different color, marking them as abandoned. 57 star systems that had been full of human life and activity were now empty monuments to a species that had chosen to leave rather than stay. Speaker, Quinn said softly, the Terran Council representatives are requesting another meeting. They want to discuss the situation. The Terran Council was what remained of human government, but it was just artificial intelligence systems now. The humans had left their computers running to handle basic administrative tasks, but the AI systems could only follow programmed responses. They couldn't explain why the humans left or where they went. Schedule it for tomorrow, Vexhari said, though I doubt they'll tell us anything new. She thought about her last real conversation with Jake Miller. It had been during a break-in council sessions about trade route disputes. She had complained about how complicated humans made everything with their detailed analysis and careful consideration of every possible outcome. Why can't your people just make simple decisions like the rest of us? She had asked. Jake had looked at her with that patient expression and said, We've learned that simple decisions often create complicated problems later. We prefer complicated decisions that create simple solutions. At the time, she had thought, he was being typically human and overthinking everything. Now she wondered if that conversation had been his way of trying to explain something important that she had been too impatient to understand. The investigation teams had found evidence. that humans had been planning their departure for years. Hidden communication networks, secret resource stockpiles, and exploration missions to uncharted regions of space. They had been preparing to leave while still participating fully in council activities. They had never stopped contributing, never stopped helping, never stopped trying to make things work, but they had also never stopped preparing for the possibility that it wouldn't work. That was perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all. The humans had not left in anger or frustration. They had left as a carefully planned operation executed with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. They had given the Council every chance to accept them as equals, and, when it became clear that would never happen, they had quietly moved on to find somewhere that would. Vex Hari stood alone in the empty chamber and felt the weight of what had been lost. The Council continued to function, but something essential was missing. The careful voices that had always asked the hard questions were gone. The patient mediators who had prevented so many conflicts were gone. The innovative thinkers who had solved impossible problems were gone. In the silence of the empty human section, Vex Hari finally understood what Jake Miller had meant about complicated decisions creating simple solutions. The humans had made the most complicated decision possible, to leave everything they had built and start over somewhere else. But it had created a very simple solution to their problem of never being truly accepted. The council chamber had never felt so large or so empty, and Vex Hari knew that no amount of searching would bring the humans back until the council could offer them something they had never offered before: genuine respect as equals.